On behalf of Abbey Comere Heritage Trust, can I say how pleased we are to have Professor Hugh Pryce talking to us about Llywelyn ap Gruffudd, Prince of Wales, his rise and fall. So Hugh, if you would like to take over.
Okay, thanks, Mel, and thank you to the Trust for the invitation to speak to you this evening. I was told this morning I should introduce myself, so I'll keep that very briefly, but until I retired almost 2 years ago, I was Professor of Welsh History at Bangor University, where I'm Professor Emeritus, and I'm also an Honorary Professor at Cardiff University. And I've worked extensively on the history of medieval Wales, perhaps most relevantly for tonight's talk, the volume there on the left, which is a collection of charters, letters, and other documents issued in the names of the Welsh princes of the 12th and 13th century. So I've edited all of Llywelyn ap Gruffudd's documents. As part of that, that was back in 2005. More recently, I've become very interested in how the history of Wales has been written, and that's the subject of my most recent book there on the right, which was published earlier this year by Oxford University Press on writing Welsh history from the early Middle Ages to the 21st century. So that again includes coverage both of the Middle Ages and how medieval Welsh history has been understood, you know, down to today as well. That's one of the themes in it. But without further ado, let's, whoops, wait a minute. Oh, there we are. Good. So today, anyway, quite appropriately, obviously, we're a day late in a sense for the actual day of Llywelyn's death on the 11th of December in 1282. I just want to talk, you know, fairly generally, but not too generally, I think, about Llywelyn and his significance, and focusing in a way on his career as falling into sort of two broad halves. So we look at his rise. How did he come to power so he could be recognized as Prince of Wales by the English crown? Then the second part, I look at the Treaty of Montgomery in 1267, where Llywelyn was officially recognized by Henry III as Prince of Wales with the Principality of Wales, but sort of consider to what extent that treaty was in some ways both a confirmation of his power, but also perhaps sowed the seeds for his fall, which is the subject of the last part of the talk this evening. So to begin with, Llywelyn's rise, clearly there were certain sort of preconditions, if you like, that Llywelyn needed to become a powerful ruler. He was born into the dynasty of Gwynedd in northwest Wales, a dynasty that had really kind of recovered control in the early 12th century under Gruffudd ap Cynan there. Our Llywelyn, though, was, if you like, an unexpected member of the dynasty to end up having so much power. He was the grandson, as you can see, of an earlier Llywelyn, Llywelyn ap Iorwerth, or Llywelyn the Great, a very powerful and significant ruler earlier in the 13th century. But he was a son of Llywelyn's illegitimate son, Gruffudd, who in a way was sort of shouldered out of the succession by his father in favor of his younger half-brother Dafydd, who succeeded Llywelyn in 1240, but died young in 1246. And that was what gave the opportunity for Llywelyn in the end to rise to power. But his father, Gruffudd, had been imprisoned in the Tower of London. He tried to escape on St. David's Day, 1244, but the bedclothes he used as a sort of makeshift sort of rope broke, as you can see in this image from Matthew Paris's history, and that was the end of him. But he left 4 sons, who you can see The eldest, in fact, was Owain, and then there's Llywelyn and Dafydd and Rhodri. So he belongs to the right family, but ironically, though his grandfather had tried to make sure that his legitimate son, who was born to his wife Joan, the illegitimate daughter of the King of England, King John, would succeed, Dafydd's premature death left scope for the sons of Gruffudd then to have a stake in the Principality of Gwynedd. So that's sort of very briefly the kind of family background. And this Treaty of Woodstock in 1247 in a way showed how difficult it was for Llywelyn at the beginning because of the power of the English crown under Henry III, and the crown took advantage of the death of Dafydd in 1246 to, in a way, reduce the power of the rulers of Gwynedd. Already after Dafydd died there, 1246, the eldest son, Owain, and then Llywelyn had agreed to share Gwynedd, and that was a sort of deal done with the sort of notables of Gwynedd then. But then the crown intervenes in the Treaty of Woodstock, and those brothers have to surrender the eastern part of Gwynedd here, the 4 cantrefs, and also for the first time in the history of Wales, they had to agree to hold the rest of Gwynedd, so what we think of more as Gwynedd today in the northwest, from the crown in return for giving military service to the King of England. So a very subordinate position. On the other hand, as you can see on the 3rd bullet point there, King Henry III hadn't enforced a concession made by Dafydd back in 1241 that Gwynedd would actually escheat to the crown, that is, be confiscated by the crown and become part of the crown lands, that become part of the English king's lands, if Dafydd died without a legitimate heir. And Dafydd died without any son, any children, in 1246. But as you can see, this isn't a very auspicious beginning for someone who ends up being Prince of Wales. Well, a lot of princely politics in Wales in the 12th and 13th centuries was family politics. It was struggles within princely families. It's not just a question of conflicts with the English or even with other Welsh rulers or with marcher lords, but within your own family. And this was certainly true with there being 4 brothers. And Llywelyn was clearly very determined. And by 1255, on the sort of the borders of Arfon and Efionydd here, he defeated and captured 2 of his brothers, Owain and Dafydd, at the Battle of Bryn Derwyn, which gave Llywelyn sole control of most of what we call Gwynedd Uwch Conwy, or Gwynedd west of the River Conwy, so northwest Gwynedd there. And the eldest brother, Owain, actually remained a prisoner, possibly in Dolbadan Castle in Llanberis, though the earliest references to that are much later in the early modern period. But he certainly remained a prisoner until he was released under the terms of a later treaty we'll come on to later in 1277. And this Owain seems to have died about 1282. But this victory in 1255 was an important step in Llywelyn establishing his authority over his own kin and his brothers in particular. And after that, you get the really important, I think, next stage, which puts him in a position to be a contender to be considered Prince of Wales, namely a series of military campaigns where he expands his power out of Gwynedd, to the west of the Conwy, over other parts of Wales. So I don't know how clear all these arrows are here, but the important point is this series of campaigns. First of all, he's recovering what he surrendered in 1247, the 4 cantrefs, Gwynedd East Conwy, the east of the Conwy there. So he's recovering, if you like, the whole of Gwynedd. And also he's annexing Meirionnydd and southern Powys in 1257 to 8. He restores the north of Ceredigion to the native dynasty there. So in a way, he's establishing influence, though he's not ruling it directly. And also Ystrad Tywi, if you like, the sort of heartland of Deheubarth, where, say, the castle of Dinever is located. After these victories, he makes a truce with Henry III, and he starts now to seek recognition as Prince of Wales. His power is expanding beyond Gwynedd, and he's wanting recognition of that, but that doesn't really get anywhere at this point. And he's also going into this sort of area of what we call the Middle March down here in the early 1260s. So a series of military campaigns, and of course, military power and military skill were essential attributes of a medieval Welsh prince like this in order to be able to build up their power. Okay, so how does he consolidate this hegemony? Well, it's quite interesting that he gathers an assembly. I'm quoting from one version of what we call the Chronicle of the Princes, Brita Tywysogion, in 1258, where these magnates of Wales, according to this report, gave an oath of allegiance to Llywelyn. And also in the same year, he made an agreement with barons who were opposed to King Alexander III, King of the Scots. We don't need to really go into the problems in Scotland, but the significance of this agreement, well, it's significant, trying to get support beyond Wales, obviously, but this is the first document where he's called Prince of Wales rather than just say Prince of North Wales. So, you can see his ambitions already in the late 1250s to establish this sort of overlordship over at least the native Welsh rulers. Those ambitions are becoming evident then. And then that's when he makes his first offer of homage the following year in 1259, and also payments to King Henry III in return for receiving the homages of the other Welsh rulers. And I'll come on to what homage means in a minute, but basically he's trying to buy the status of Prince of Wales from the King of England and to get a formal acknowledgement of his overlordship from 1259 onwards, but it takes another 8 years before that succeeds. It's just a sort of aside, since we've got this image here of Alexander III. You can see he's enthroned in a very sort of splendid fashion with his scepters and so on. And that there's a nice contrast there with the most of the 13th century Welsh princes. Now, I say that, but we don't really know in the case of Llywelyn, because no seal impressions, we don't have wax seal impressions on any documents he issued that survive. So we don't know what his seal looked like. We know he had a seal because after the Edwardian conquest, his seal, that of his queen, his Princess Eleanor, and his brother David were melted down on Edward I's orders and made into a chalice that was donated to the Abbey of Vale Royal as a sort of one of the spoils of conquest. So clearly he had a seal. And he may have been depicted as enthroned. This is completely speculation, but his uncle, David ap Llywelyn, who died in 1246, we do have one fragmentary impression where he is clearly enthroned on one side of the seal, and he seems to have imitated Henry III's Great Seal. And because Joan was his mother, Henry III was get this right, I think the uncle of David. So anyway, but before the 1240s, they're just shown as knights. on their seals, Welsh princes. So that's a slight sort of aside as we go on, but nevertheless, I think quite interesting, and brings us on to the, if you like, the ideological dimension of Llywelyn's power, because as he starts to try and assert himself as something bigger than just the Prince of Gwynedd, he starts to use titles to convey that, and titles like this shouldn't be dismissed simply as sort of empty words or, you know, sort of delusional kind of expressions of grandeur, but they are, I think, significant for an understanding of what Llywelyn was trying to achieve and how he wanted to be seen. And in the 1258 document with the Scots, he's just Prince of Wales. But from 1262, he does adopt a new title, which at first sight might seem a bit strange, namely Prince of Wales and Lord of Snowdon, or possibly more accurately, Snowdonia. And this was adapted from a title that his grandfather, Llywelyn the Great, Llywelyn ap Iorwerth, had used in the 1230s, which was Prince of Aberfraw, that is the court of the princes on Anglesey, and according to the Welsh laws, the chief court of Gwynedd with superiority over the other Welsh princes' courts. So a code for Prince of Wales, but he's not explicitly saying it, whereas Llywelyn ap Gruffudd is quite explicit, he's Prince of Wales, but they both share this Lord of Snowdon or Snowdonia, which conveys the immediate authority they had as lords over the lands of Gwynedd, the mountainous landscape of Gwynedd. So it's sort of showing, if you like, their authority over their sort of home patch, whereas the princely title, as opposed to the lordly title, expresses this ambition to have a much wider authority in Wales. And it's also very interesting how that title is mirrored after he marries Eleanor. We'll come back to his marriage to Eleanor de Montfort, but in her letters, a number of which survive, she has a parallel title, which, if you like, reinforces Llywelyn's by being called Princess of Wales and Lady of Snowdon. But it's quite interesting when we come onto the Treaty of Montgomery that the English crown wasn't so sure about this, and he's just Prince of Wales there. I was mentioning his uncle Dafydd perhaps imitating the Royal Seal of England, and it may be that Llywelyn's arms with these 4 lions were adapted from the royal arms of England, because kings of England were seen as truly royal and powerful, and in a way they were trying to get a sort of reflected glory of that and appropriating this imagery, along with this sort of the imagery on the coats of arms and the seals for their own ends. Now, I mentioned Eleanor de Montfort, who became Llywelyn's wife, and she's the daughter of Simon de Montfort, who was leader of the baronial opposition to Henry III. And Llywelyn begins cooperating with Simon in 1263, and this leads to the first agreement technically with the English crown, with Henry III, at Pipton in Breconshire in 1265. And this, if you like, foreshadows the much fuller agreement that was made 2 years later in the Treaty of Montgomery, which I'll come on to shortly. So in 1265, you get a real sense of what Llywelyn was trying to do. He's taking advantage of the weakness of Henry III. Simon de Montfort is de facto ruler. He's in charge of the royal government. So Henry, in a way, is a pawn, having his name on this document. But you can see what Llywelyn is trying to do. You can see there that he's offering this money, 30,000 marks, which was the equivalent of £20,000, in return for being recognized that he held the Principality of Wales from the king. And he recognized that he held from the king what he called our Principality of Wales and all we have and hold. And what I find most interesting is this clause that I've summarized at the bottom, how he said he'd render all the services that were due from the principality, which had been given by his predecessors, the princes of Wales. So he's inventing earlier princes of Wales who hadn't officially been recognized at all, though his uncle Dafydd, and indeed Owain Gwynedd, his great-grandfather, had called themselves princes of Wales earlier, but he's tried to create a kind of historic lineage of princes of Wales in the language, our predecessors, the princes of Wales there. And, you know, he's in this document, I think it's quite interesting that he's in a way implying that the principality is something that's always been there, but he's sort of deigning to recognize that he holds it from the King of England. But this didn't last very long, only a couple of months really, because as you can see at the bottom, Simon de Montfort was killed by royal forces, I think led by Prince Edward, the future Edward I, at the Battle of Evesham in August that year. So, you know, it's interesting as a sort of historical document, but its practical effect, that the agreement at Pipton, was very short-lived, as you can see. Simon de Montfort still celebrated in Leicester, as this statue at the top there shows. Okay, so we've got Llywelyn to a point where he's established himself with his own family. He's expanded his authority through military campaigns over broader areas of territory in Wales, and he started to try and get recognition of a superior status within Wales as Prince of Wales, and adopting a new title, and trying to get this agreement with the Crown. But that, as I say, collapsed. So this brings us to the second part of what I want to say, and to look at the Treaty of Montgomery, which was more substantial and lasted longer, which was made really as part, in a sense, the last chapter of a series of peace negotiations following the end of what we call the Barons' Wars in England, after Simon de Montfort's defeat and the baronial opposition came to terms with the Crown. And it's very important that, in a way, it's an international agreement, because, as you can see at the top there, it's negotiated by a papal legate, Cardinal Ottobuono, and he, in fact, later became Pope, very briefly, in 1276 as Adrian V, and he has his tomb there in Viterbo in Italy. So this Italian legate had come over to try and establish peace, and one of his jobs was to make peace between Llywelyn and the Welsh and the government of Henry III. And this was ratified in this ford, it seems, literally on what was seen as a border near Montgomery at Rhytwyma in September 1267. And I'll come on to the details of the agreement in a moment, but the crucial points I've summarized here just to get us sort of orientated with this. In a way, it's a reprise of what had been done with de Montfort, and Henry grants to Llywelyn the Principality of Wales and the title Prince of Wales, and the homages of all but one of the other Welsh lords, which means they'll be directly under Llywelyn and no longer directly under the king. And in return, Llywelyn agreed to give homage to the king and to pay 25,000 marks, which in fact is a bit less than at Pipton, which I think is 30,000, which was over £16,000 in installments. Okay, so that briefly, so this peace agreement is an interesting document for many reasons. It's very cleverly put together, I think, and clearly sort of influence of the papal legate on this and negotiations. But the first 8 clauses don't actually call Llywelyn Prince. They talk about various territorial disputes, and once, in a sense, those have been sorted out, or they've made arrangements, how to sort those out. Then we come on to this crucial clause, number 9, what I translated here, the Lord King of England. Of course, all these documents were in Latin, I should perhaps have stressed earlier. The Lord King of England, wishing to magnify the person of the aforesaid Llywelyn by his pure liberality and grace, gives and concedes to the aforesaid Llywelyn and his heirs the Principality of Wales, so that the same Llywelyn and his heirs may be called and be Princes of Wales. So if you like, the legal fiction almost is that this is a completely new creation by the King of England. That's this kind of face-saving thing, though obviously it's a recognition of real power achieved in battle and in terms of the influence Llywelyn has in Wales. But nevertheless, it's important for the diplomacy of this to present Llywelyn as being granted the principality and the title prince by the king, so that king's superiority is absolutely explicit. And then there's this clause about the other, what they call the Welsh barons of Wales. These are basically other Welsh princes and lords, that he receives their fealty and homages. I'll come on to those terms in a moment, except for one of them in the southwest, Maredydd ap Pryce. And then Llywelyn in turn will give homage, fealty and service to the king for the principality. And then finally, there's clause 16 there, a promise to pay the 25,000 marks for the privilege of, in a sense, having the principality. So it clearly mattered to him to have this principality and to be recognized. And he hoped to have some sort of stability in the relationship with the King of England. The fact he was willing to offer these large sums. And it's interesting that earlier at Pipton, it was a shorter document, less specific. In fact, it doesn't explicitly say that Llywelyn will give homage to the king. It just talks about accustomed services his predecessors had given. So this is a sort of tighter legal definition in this one, I think. Wait a minute. Let's. There we are. Homage. Okay. So Llywelyn is the first Welsh ruler to get this recognition, this official recognition from the King of England as Prince of Wales over an entity called the Principality of Wales. I mean, I think that's important. Then this meant a change of policy on the part of the English crown, because up until then, it had been very keen to assert its lordship in Wales over each individual Welsh prince and lord, say that they were directly under the king. Whereas now we have what I've called here a kind of form of devolution, that there's a hierarchy. So in a way, Llywelyn mediates the power of the king in Wales. So Llywelyn does homage, but on behalf of all the other Welsh lords, who in turn do homage to him rather than to the King of England. So clearly that's elevating Llywelyn's status as a sort of bridge between the crown and the other Welsh lords. Now, this theory had, as I just put up, already been articulated by Welsh lawyers back in the time of Llywelyn the Great. The idea that there'd be a sort of hierarchy. It's put in a sort of archaic kind of language, but it has a very contemporary political resonance. It talks about the king in Aberfraw giving gold to the King of London, for example, and then rulers in other Welsh courts making payments to the ruler in Aberfraw, the Prince of Wales. But in the time of his grandfather, as I mentioned earlier, his grandfather, Llywelyn the Great, never went as far as to call himself Prince of Wales. He kind of tried to fudge it with this kind of symbolic title, Prince of Aberfraw and Lord of Snowdon, because he had achieved a personal hegemony over much of native Wales in the last years of his rule, but he didn't feel he could call himself Prince of Wales, as much perhaps because other Welsh rulers mightn't have liked it, found that too intrusive, as perhaps he was worried about offending the King of England. But whatever, the point I want to make now is that his grandson Llywelyn ap Gruffudd does get recognized Prince of Wales, but of course it's important that he feels he needs to have this official recognition mediated by the Pope's representative in 1267. Now, one question that arises is, given the fact that Llywelyn earlier talked about his predecessors, the princes of Wales and so on, but in a way he seems to have seen it as his own kind of creation. How independent was it really of the crown? I mean, in theory, clearly it wasn't independent. It was meant to be, under Henry III, Llywelyn was meant to give homage. And as we've seen, the language of the treaty stressed that the principality was in fact a creation of the English crown. This is, I've cited that before, I don't need to read it again, but that's how the crown saw it, as a creation by them, that they'd given it to Llywelyn. However, it's clear that Llywelyn saw it differently, I think. There are sort of various clues. We've seen one, this reference to his predecessors, the princes of Wales. Already, as I've mentioned, some of his predecessors had sometimes called themselves Prince of Wales. The big difference now is that in 1267, Llywelyn is formally recognized as Prince of Wales, ruling a Principality of Wales, whereas earlier rulers of Gwynedd had, if you like, made rhetorical statements, declarations that they were Prince of Wales, in the earliest cases in correspondence with the King of France, in fact, in the time of Owain Gwynedd in the 1160s. But nevertheless, that wasn't recognized by the King of England as far as we can see. David ap Llywelyn in the 1240s, in the last couple of years of his life, when he was fighting the English, very assertively called himself Prince of Wales then, but that was, if you like, a challenge to the crown that wasn't recognized. And it may be that Llywelyn thought that if he had the formal agreement, this would mean the crown would have to, in a way, defend his principality or uphold it. I mean, it wasn't just purely a concession to the greater power of the King of England, but that he was, going to benefit from this recognition. Though the problem was in interpreting the terms of the agreement, and that's what I just want to talk a little bit about next, because the Treaty of Montgomery, in a way, did have weaknesses that helped to explain why Llywelyn's, if you like, high point of authority here didn't last. I mean, there are various problems. One is that the Principality of Wales, as defined in the treaty, covered only the parts of Wales essentially ruled by Welsh dynasties, and didn't include the Marcher lordships here. These areas have been conquered by Llywelyn. These ones in blue were vassals. They were Welsh lords and princes under Llywelyn. This is Gwynedd, his own patrimony, if you like, the earldom of Chester up there and so forth. But there were ambiguities. I mean, the treaty, as I said, wasn't comprehensive or definitive, and nowhere does the document, though it's quite long, define precisely the territorial extent. It doesn't say what the borders are of this principality. Presumably that was a deliberate fudge. And so some territories, their status was left undefined, really. Brecon and Gwerthrynion Mailenydd here, the Middlemarch here, this sort of uncertainty. Nor were the Welsh barons of Wales defined. Who were they precisely? Did they include, for example, in Glamorgan, this was basically the lords of Glamorgan were by now the Clare family, but there were still Welsh lords in the uplands, upland Glamorgan, who were the descendants of sort of Welsh royal dynasty in Glamorgan. Were they among the Welsh barons of Wales? Well, there's no mention of them in the document, and indeed the Welsh barons of Wales, it's left as a sort of rather ambivalent term. So there were various uncertainties there. Now, there were also financial costs. As you've seen, Llywelyn promised to pay all this money. So the 25,000 marks, mostly in annual installments, 3,000 marks a year. And so a mark was equivalent to 13 shillings and 4 pence in old money, if you like. So those were the equivalents there on the screen. Now, it's likely, though we're guessing really, but his annual income from various renders and so on was only between £3,000 and £3,500, about 5,000 marks. So this was going to be a big drain on his resources in that case, especially as it seems he could only tax his own Principality of Gwynedd. And certainly we know that there were complaints that his rule had become oppressive, though the complaints were most clear really after he was defeated, perhaps by people who wanted to sort of have the favour of the English crown then. But nevertheless, I don't think they can be dismissed out of hand. Then we know he stopped making payments after some years. In January 1272, though he only refused to make them in February 2 years later. And it does seem that he did actually find most of the money for the early years when he was paying, some 15,000 out of 17,000 marks. So, you know, this explains why historians disagree as to whether Llywelyn stopped paying because he just couldn't afford it, it was too expensive, or that he decided to make a point of principle for reasons I'll come on to, a sort of political statement that he wouldn't pay anymore because he felt that the English crown wasn't keeping to its side of the 1267 agreement. So, I mean, I don't have time to go into that now, but there is debate as to, you know, why he stopped. But the point to stress here is that, you know, not just Llywelyn, but the people, you know, essentially people who are farming and producing, you know, crops and tending cattle and so on, ended up having to foot the bill for this great status symbol of being Prince of Wales. And, you know, this in turn had political costs at the sort of, if you like, the higher levels of Welsh society. And we know that some of the most powerful families in Gwynedd turned to the English crown for patronage, especially when they saw which way, if you like, the wind was blowing. So after Edward I's first war against Llywelyn, the First Welsh War of 1277, you start to see this sort of shift. And then, as I mentioned it a moment ago, there were complaints after the Second War, the sort of final conquest. There were complaints in 1283 by what was described as the community of Gwynedd, sort of presumably free men of Gwynedd, that Llywelyn kind of trampled on their traditional rights. So yeah, there is some evidence to suggest that the principality was costly in terms not just of money, but also of maintaining the loyalty of key players within Gwynedd. So, you know, there was a downside to making this offer of paying this money, even though he stopped after some years. You know, nevertheless, you know, he still clearly was, I think, making additional demands to sort of finance his various projects and his ambition to be Prince of Wales. The image there is a much later imagining of a meeting that never happened in the Parliament in I think Westminster. So you've got Edward the First there, surrounded by Alexander III, who was a long-lived monarch, died in 1286 in Scotland, and then Llywelyn there, but they didn't actually all come together. But this sort of book of pedigrees from around 1530 shows them there. So there aren't many images we can use. That's why I sent that as the sort of image for the poster for this talk. Okay, so this leads on, the question is, was the Treaty of Montgomery, the recognition of Llywelyn as prince, ruling a principality, the crowning achievement of Llywelyn, or just a costly liability? And in a way, that's something you have to decide. There's arguments both ways. I mean, on the one hand, clearly he did achieve what his grandfather Llywelyn the Great had sought in vain. Llywelyn the Great clearly wanted to be recognized as having this sort of mediating position between the king and the other Welsh princes and lords. And that's clear in 1218, before the so-called Treaty of Worcester, which is a series of agreements early in Henry III's reign. But on the other hand, it only lasted 10 years, the treaty, because the principality is in effect dismantled after Edward's First Welsh War in the Treaty of Aberconwy. Llywelyn has been defeated. He's able to keep the title of Prince of Wales, but it's rather an empty title after that. And nevertheless, it's interesting that the title Prince of Wales and the idea of a Principality of Wales was thought worth keeping by Edward I after the conquest. And of course, in a sense that survived down to today. And in some ways, a way of legitimating the conquest of Edward. And he makes his son, the future Edward II, of course, the first English Prince of Wales after the conquest. Okay, so now we come to the sort of, in a sense, the last part of what I want to talk about, Llywelyn's fall. As I've already been suggested, there were tensions in the agreement in 1267. Llywelyn was at least losing some support at home. It was expensive to pay for the privilege of being Prince of Wales. So I think there's sort of 2 points that perhaps help explain why things really turned against Llywelyn. One is that there's a new king on the throne in England, Edward I, who is very determined to stick up for all his rights as he sees them. He was actually away on crusade when he succeeded Henry III in 1272. He isn't back for a couple of years, but he's got officials already, ruling on his behalf. And it's interesting that it sort of coincides, his succession, with Llywelyn stopping his payments to the crown. But he isn't refusing, but he stops making them. And also, interestingly, he ignores an order to stop building a castle, the castle of Dolforwyn, of which there are remains today, of course, to the west there of Montgomery. And he again, this gives you a further insight into how he saw the principality, because he writes this very defiant letter to the sort of royal representatives. And, he says, it's sort of rhetoric, but he said he couldn't believe that such a letter would have come to him if the king had been in the country. There must be some mistake. And then he makes this statement, I translate: the rights of our principality are entirely separate from the rights of your kingdom, even though we may hold our principality under your power. So he's really talking up the status of his principality there. And he's saying, look, you've got no right to do this. And he's playing down his obligations as the vassal of the King of England. So, you know, you can see this kind of points of conflict are starting to emerge there, even before Edward's back in England. Then things were made worse by an internal conspiracy, which involved his youngest brother, Dafydd, and Gruffudd ap Gwynwynwyn, the Prince of Southern Powys, a conspiracy to assassinate Llywelyn, with the idea that Dafydd would succeed his brother as Prince of Wales and his daughter would marry Gruffudd's son, Owain. So this really, I think, is seen as it was quite a shock for Llywelyn, as though there's sort of complications in interpreting what exactly happened. But you know, clearly there was a conspiracy. Now, once Edward is back in England, Llywelyn, I think, does face a very determined opponent, and you know, historians disagree as to whether Llywelyn responded to this in the most prudent fashion, even though one might sympathize with perhaps some of the reasons why he was defiant. So to start with, he doesn't turn up to the coronation on the 19th of August, 1274, of the new king, which you might argue would be a kind of good diplomatic thing to do. But he doesn't go. And this may be because, you know, already he's seeing the crown as backing those conspirators. The conspiracy was back in February 1274, and they flee to England and get sort of shelter there. So you have to remember that has sort of made things worse. And then, despite the Treaty of Montgomery saying that Llywelyn owed homage to the king, Llywelyn refuses to give it. He ignores 5 summons to do that in the period from December 1274 to April 1276. So, you know, he's being very defiant, and Edward insists he does give homage unconditionally. That is, he he puts his hands within Edward's and formally acknowledges that he holds his principality from the king. That Llywelyn, again, is not willing to really recognize or show he recognizes that. So a further point of friction between Llywelyn and Edward was Llywelyn's marriage in 1275 to Simon de Montfort's daughter, Eleanor. Now, I mean, this raises a variety of questions, which, you know, why did he marry so late? He's been, in a way, in the right, you know, very much active since the 1240s, and this is 1275. And I'll come on to the plans for succession in a moment. And was this again something provocative for Edward I? Because Edward had led, if you like, royalist forces against Simon de Montfort. He would have seen Simon de Montfort as a rebel, as absolutely sort of beyond the pale. And there's the Welsh prince marrying his daughter. I mean, the marriage, it's tragic because it ends with Eleanor dying in childbirth in 1282, as we'll see in a minute. And they have the one daughter, Gwenllian, who is taken away, according to one of the chronicles, in her cradle in winter over to Lincolnshire and put in this priory in Sempringham after the conquest in 1282. Well, the crown was clearly determined to try and stop this marriage. Now, in fact, through canon law, they were able to marry through what was known as proxy marriage. They didn't actually have to be both there together. So they were married, but they were, of course, apart. And Eleanor was in France. She sails to try and join Llywelyn in Wales, but she's kidnapped basically by ship sent on behalf of the crown, I think off the Isles of Scilly. So she's captured. And then because Llywelyn has still refused to give homage, any attempts at peace negotiations seem to have broken down. He's condemned as a rebel in November 1276, and he makes one last bid to come to terms which don't get anywhere. So this is what leads to the First Welsh War of Edward. So on the face of it, it's about Llywelyn not complying with the terms of the Treaty of Montgomery. Okay, well, anyway, the marriage may be in some ways related to that conspiracy. It may be he saw Dafydd as a possible successor until he conspired against him. It may be that Llywelyn had already agreed with her father that they'd marry Simon de Montfort, but he only brought the plans to fruition after that conspiracy. But I'm speculating. But it is odd that there was he didn't have he hadn't married. There was no heir of his body. He seems to have kind of neglected to take care of the succession until really quite late, and that ended tragically. Well, anyway, I don't want to go into details about Edward's first war, but essentially it's a very effective campaign that leads to Llywelyn's submission in November in Aberconwy in Conwy, where, as I said, he keeps the title Prince of Wales, but he loses most of his principality. So he's still got control of the sort of horizontal lines, the bits there, but he has to give back again the 4 cantrefs, surrender those, and he keeps the homages only of the Lords of Gwynedd. He loses this overlordship in Powys and Deheubarth after that. So, that's clearly a huge setback there. Well, things are patched up a bit then for a while. Llywelyn and Eleanor actually celebrate their marriage, but in Edward's presence in Worcester Cathedral in 1278. But in the sense the king is now giving his blessing to that now that Llywelyn has been so much weakened. But there were tensions with Edward tightening his grip on the lands he conquered there. So there was also a dispute over the territory of Ardwystli in mid Wales with the Prince of Southern Powys, Gruffudd ap Gwenwynwyn, and Edward I said that he should have the right to judge that case. So he's trying to use his sort of overlordship as a way of intruding onto this legal dispute. So things aren't looking too good, but Llywelyn continues to rule from Gwynedd and sends letters and so on. There's one sent from Nevin in February 1282, which is an original letter in the National Archives, which I always like because it has this very rather crude but effective way of deleting errors by simply cutting the word out of the parchment there. So that's just to show a document not written by Llywelyn, I should say, by one of his clerks, but in his name and sent to the King Edward. Well, to cut a long story short, things come to a head, not because Llywelyn is found to have been disobedient or anything, but because his younger brother Dafydd, who had been restored to lands in northeast Wales, suddenly attacks Harden Castle on Palm Sunday 1282. This provokes Edward to organize a campaign. Llywelyn doesn't immediately join in. He's in a very difficult position because there'd been complaints about the treatment of crown officers of the Welsh in the northeast, but he kind of holds back until, as I mentioned earlier, Eleanor died giving birth to their daughter Gwenllian in June. And after that, he probably thought he hadn't got anything to lose. And he becomes very actively involved in the uprising but it basically doesn't go well for Llywelyn, Gwynedd being encircled. There are attempts by the Archbishop of Canterbury, John Peacham, there's his effigy in Canterbury Cathedral, to mediate, though Peacham is very much on the king's side doing that. Llywelyn was offered a barony in England, but no way was going to accept that. And it's interesting how his council are very defiant and saying, well, these lands have been ruled since the time of the legendary Brutus and his son Camber. Camber gave his name to Cambria, according to Geoffrey of Monmouth. But anyway, Llywelyn was killed at Kilmary, which I hardly need to tell this audience, on the 11th of December. And then his brother David, who'd continued fighting, was captured. First, the castle of Castellfabera was taken, and then in June, he's captured and executed as a traitor, hung, drawn, and quartered. Very nasty end for David in Shrewsbury in October. So, that very, very briefly is the end, and Edward I takes over. So that very much is the fall of Llywelyn. So I'm sorry, I've gone on slightly longer than I hoped, but let me just sum up briefly the sort of points I've been trying to make. So, there's different ways of looking at Llywelyn, really. I mean, you can certainly say he achieved more than any previous Welsh prince, in the sense that he created the Principality of Wales that was recognised by the Crown and the title Prince of Wales. And the great medieval historian John Goronwy Edwards liked to stress that, contrary to the tradition of referring to Llywelyn as Llywelyn the last Prince of Wales, which isn't really true. I mean, Owain Glyndwr was the last Prince of Wales in any case, but we should think of him as the first Prince of Wales because of the Treaty of Montgomery and so on. And we should emphasize that. And so, I think that's an important point to make. But of course, having achieved more, he also had more to lose. And in the end, that principality proved very short-lived. And, it was conquered. And it may be that, in a sense, the seeds of all that, as I tried to suggest before, lay in the Treaty of Montgomery and some of the sort of loose ends that hadn't been tied up, some of the ambiguities, and also in differing interpretations of what that meant. I think Llywelyn, he has a much higher view of the principality as basically something that he's created through his own efforts, and that there is a sort of earlier tradition of thinking of a Principality of Wales, which his predecessors had expressed. On the other hand, of course, the Crown wants to stress that it's a creation of the Crown and that the Prince is subordinate to the King. And then, importantly, disputes with Marcher Lords not being resolved, which I think makes a big difference. And also you've got, difficulties because of the personalities. Edward I proved a very determined opponent who was willing to invest the time and effort into conquest. And so some might argue Llywelyn was perhaps not as prudent as he could have been in some of his actions, that he was too ready to provoke Edward, and that he didn't realize that the king was far more serious to him than Henry III. But, Edward may in any case have thought the simplest solution was to conquer Wales, and that was what he was really looking to do, come what may. And I don't think there's a sort of straightforward answer to what happened there. Of course, having said, it all came to an end, as I mentioned earlier, in a sort of ironic sense. The Principality of Wales and the title Prince of Wales did continue, but that's a subject for another lecture, the extent to which that helped to sustain a kind of sense of Welsh distinctiveness in later centuries. But thank you very much for your patience, and I'll end there.